Hello and welcome to our third video for building small checkpoint web. During this video, we will configure firewall interfaces, check interface status, configure expert mode password, and new default shell for admin user. Also, we will install SmartConsole, configure a new cluster object in SmartConsole, push policy, investigate logs, see why traffic is dropped, and also we will use some cluster troubleshooting commands, but only the basic one. At this point, we have our three VMs running, and we have already configured Ethernet 0, Ethernet 1 for all the VMs. Let's now log into SSH of our gateways, and let's configure Ethernet 2 interface, and also we will see how to log into the firewalls using SSH. We can use built-in Windows terminal. We put SSH admin, then the IP address of our gateway, and then we enter our password. Now we are in clish configuration mode. Also on the firewall we have expert configuration mode. Clish mostly used for configuring and a little bit for troubleshooting. Expert used more for troubleshooting, and you cannot configure almost anything with expert mode. For this you will have to use clish. Also, of course, you can apply some configuration with GUI, but I prefer using CLI. To log into expert mode, we need to first set up expert password. Before we set up the password, we cannot log into expert mode. For gateway 1, I already set expert password before during testing of this VM. Let's just redo this step. The command is set expert password, and then enter the password. Now I'm entering the new one. Now I can go to expert mode and use password. Expert mode is basically a Unix bash shell, and here we can use standard Unix command like ifconfig. We see that here we have either 0, Ethernet 1, we don't have Ethernet 2, despite of the fact that we have this interface on the VM, and we have a loopback interface. So what we will do, we will enable Ethernet 2 interface to make it available for configuration. So to do that, we go back to clish, type in exit, and we first change interface state from off to on. So it's set interface Ethernet 2 state on. Okay, if we go back to expert, now ifconfig will show us Ethernet 2 interface, but it has no IP address because we didn't configure it yet. So we go back. Now we type set interface Ethernet 2 IPv4 address. Then we type in the address. It's 1.1.1.1. Then mask length for our mask length is 30. Let's double check with the diagram. For VMnet 3, it is 1.1.1.0/30. And we want to save config, to save our configuration. Expert ifconfig. Now we have the IP address. It also kindly shows the broadcast IP and the mask. Good. Actually, I prefer use more of expert mode for troubleshooting and checking the state of interfaces and everything else. That's why I want to set the default shell to bin bash. For this, I will use command set user admin because we are setting the shell for user admin shell. And if you press tab, we see all the different shells we can use. Bin bash is the one we want. If you want set the default shell back to clish, we just use etc clish. Now just save config, and that's it. Now we have this gateway ready for our sync interface, because Ethernet 2 is our sync interface for cluster Excel. Now we can exit. If we log in back, now we see we are already in expert mode. If we want to go to clish, we type clish. Want to exit, type exit, and exit. Okay, good. To configure gateway 2, I will use PuTTY. I have pre-configured session here for gateway 2. I can open admin. Also, I have access to clish. Let's right away set expert password. Set expert password and type in the password. Now, it looks like I did a typo. Let's try again. Okay, good. This is the first time I'm setting up the expert password for this VM, so it didn't ask me for my previous password. Yeah, also, right away, we will set shell to bin bash as the default shell. Let's set interface Ethernet to state on and set interface Ethernet to IPv4 address 1.1.1.1.2 mask length of 30 and save. Okay, if we go to expert, now we have all the interfaces configured with the IP address. You do not need always use expert mode to just check the status of the interface. You can do show interface Ethernet to, and it will show you basically the same information but in more readable format. Here you also see the state, you see the MAC address here and here. You have the MTU, link state, speed, duplex, everything. Okay, good. Before we start configuring the cluster, let's check what's current status of our cluster. Before we configure anything, what we should check if the gateway is actually ready to join any cluster. We can check this with cpconfig, and if we see here, enable checkpoint cluster except for breach active standby, we don't need this. Enable checkpoint per virtual system state, we don't need this. Disable cluster membership for this gateway. As soon as we have disable, means that it's already enabled. This means that actually cluster gateway membership for this gateway is already enabled. We can exit, we don't need to change anything. If for some reason during the first time configuration wizard you forgot to enable the checkbox that this gateway will be part of the cluster, then you will need to select number 6 and follow the instruction on screen to enable cluster membership for this gateway. It will actually require reboot, but that's nothing to be afraid of. To check the cluster status, we want to use the command cphaprob state, and it states that HA module is not started. This means that this gateway doesn't know right now that it should be part of the cluster. How can we inform the gateway that it should be part of the cluster? For this, we will need to push these settings from Smart Management Server. And to do this, we will have to first install Smart Dashboard. Let's go ahead and install SmartConsole on our laptop. To do that, first we need to download the installation file. You can download the installation file um, from web GUI of Smart Management Server. That's the link on the top of the screen. It is quite fast download because it will happen right from the VM to your download folder. We will not do that because we did it during one of our previous videos. So it's right here. Just double click and it will start the installation. Yeah, we have read and agree to the license agreement. We are ready to install. Okay, it's finished. Before launching SmartConsole, you really want to ensure that your management server is running for quite some time, because if you didn't start it before and if you started just now, it may take up to like 5, 10, 15 minutes for the Smart Management Server to start all the services which are necessary for SmartConsole to log in to the Smart Management Server. On the laptop, it may take even longer. So really don't be worried in case if your SmartConsole will start, but then you will not be able to log into your Smart Management Server. It just may take some time for all services to start. So let's finish. Okay, now we need to enter the username, our password. Remember, during the first time configuration wizard, we specified that to manage Smart Management Server, we will use built-in admin, which we used for installation of our Gaia operating system. That's why here we're able to use the same admin user with the same admin password. And here we should specify the server name, which is in my case 43.100. If you don't really plan to do any changes and you want to log in just to check something, it's always better to log in read-only mode. Now we will be changing stuff, so we will log in into read-write mode. That's a fingerprint check. We trust our server, so we will proceed. That's quite unexpected. It looks like I made a typo in the password. Let's try again. Okay, now authentication passed. And here is our SmartConsole window. Actually, a lot of new stuff happened during the migration from R80 dot something to R80 1.10, and it's not limited to the information you see on this screen. Okay, in the SmartConsole we have quite a lot of stuff to handle. We have 4 tabs here. We have our menu, we have objects, install policy, and object search pane and validations. All these we will discuss later on. Let's focus on our task to configure our first firewall cluster. To configure the cluster, we should go right here and click on this star, meaning we want to do something new. We can add a gateway, we can add a cluster, we can add a VSX gateway or cluster, and we can add checkpoint hosts. So we don't want to add any VSX. We will discuss VSX later on. What we want is to add a cluster. The critical difference worth mentioning is that if you go for VSX and you decided to add a gateway, as soon as you added the gateway, you cannot add the same gateway in any cluster. So if you did such a mistake, you will have to delete the object and then recreate the cluster. With a regular gateways, not a VSX, we can go straight to the cluster and use a wizard mode. Wizard mode is much more simple. Cluster name. Let's make it our lab cluster. Okay, it updated SmartConsole. Now I want to just continue with our lab. We need to specify cluster IPv4 address. The cluster IPv4 address shouldn't be confused with the cluster management address or anything like this. Cluster IPv4 address is the address of the main cluster interface, which is available for connection from usually from outside of our network to this cluster. And usually this main address referred to when we configure a VPN or remote access VPN. So that's why here I will specify 172.1.1.1. Let's double check on the network diagram. Yeah, that's 172.1.1.0, and here we don't have this cluster IP address. We have 2 for gateway 1, we have 3 for gateway 2, and we have 1 for our cluster IP address. So here it is. Then we checking what we need, a gateway in high availability or gateway in load sharing mode. We will select that this is a checkpoint cluster XL and it is for high availability. In high availability, we will have one gateway always active and the other gateways are always passive. There will be no load sharing between these two gateways. It's active passive. Now we need to add gateways to our cluster. Right now this cluster has 0 members. So let's add first gateway. New cluster member or existing gateway. If we would add gateway first and then decided to group these two gateways in a cluster, then we can use add existing gateway. As soon as we didn't add any gateways beforehand, we use a new cluster member. So that's a name, that's our lab gateway 1 IPv4 address. This is the address which will be used to actually communicate to this cluster member from Smart Management Server. Usually this is the management IP address of the gateway. 192.168.43.2. No IPv4 address. Now the activation key. Remember during first time configuration wizard we configured an activation key, and that's the time to remember it. And then we click initialize. Trust established means that it was successful, and then we click OK. Now we can use the same step to add a second gateway. Activation key for the second gateway. Now trust is established. We click OK. We can then click next. Next step is to configure the topology of the cluster. Okay, it detected that we have also this network, and this network is for the sync. That's cluster synchronization, and that's the only interface for cluster synchronization. Means that's the primary interface. We can have more than one interfaces for cluster synchronization. Then we can have a secondary and even the third one. We don't want actually to mistake primary secondary for two sync interfaces, let's say bonded in the bond interface, because if it is two interfaces bonded in one bond interface, still will be just single primary interface, not like primary secondary. Next. This is our external interface, and this is a cluster interface, and we should configure IP address for this cluster interface 16.1.1 with net mask 255.255.255.0. Then we can click next. And that's our management interface. Usually management interfaces are not clustered interfaces. And even on the topology, it shows that, okay, we have some interface on the side to member number 1, interface to the side for member number 2, and it is not a clustered interface. Just for testing, we can group these interfaces as a cluster interface, and actually it will save us for some problem later on, because if we will leave just one cluster interface, then we will have to disable anti-spoofing for this cluster interface, and we want really to keep it enabled, because it's much more interesting to have a lab with anti-spoofing than the lab without anti-spoofing. That's why I will select representing a cluster interface, and let's put an interface IP address 192.168.43. I have 43.1 occupied by the laptop, 43.2 by the first security gateway, 43.3 by the second security gateway, and I won't just use 43.5, so I don't like 43.4. It's 255, 255, 255.0, and then we can click next. Okay, that completes our cluster definition wizard. So we can click finish. We can also edit cluster properties, but really there is no need to do it. Finish. It will take a little bit of time to configure the changes that we did right now. Okay, we see that there is our cluster. It appeared here. It has two cluster members. All good. We have 20 database changes done to create a cluster. Before these changes are active, we should publish the changes. Right now, these changes are kind of up in the air. They are configured in SmartConsole. The changes will not yet save to the configuration database on the Smart Management server. Here we can put some description, and also we see who did the change and what was the date. Now we can publish. Okay, publish complete. Right now, Smart Management Server understands that it has a new cluster, but the gateways, they don't know yet that they have a cluster. Let's double check on this. Let's log in for our first security gateway. cphaprob state still. Oh, cphaprob state still shows that HA model is not started. And also it shows that we have initial policy. Means that there were no any policy installation yet for this security gateway. It has the default policy, which actually make a deny any policy with yeah, some rules pre-installed just for communication to smart management server. Let's exit. To make these changes active on our cluster members, we need to install policy. So what we have for security policy? It is very simple cleanup rule. It is default cleanup rule with any drop action. And also you see that there is track and set none. Means that if anything will be dropped by this rule, still there will be no logs created whatsoever. I want to see the logs for all the drops which are happening in our security policy, and also worth mentioning that it is installed on whatever policy targets we want. Policy targets will be chosen every time when we push the policy. Let's try to push the policy. Yeah, I want to publish and install. We are pushing access control and threat prevention. We don't have really anything in threat prevention, but it will not hurt us to push threat prevention as well. Also, there is very interesting install on each selected gateway independently. And for gateway cluster, if installation of cluster member fails, do not install on that cluster. Means that if one of our cluster members has a problem and then we try to push policy and one of the clusters fail to install the policy, then installation will not happen at all. Usually that's a good practice, but sometimes you want to uncheck this checkbox. Let's try to install. Okay, our first installation is successful. Let's go back to gateways and services. Right now we have this red crosses. It represents some cluster Excel problem. We will take a look on this just in a moment. Okay, and what we see here is that we cannot log in anymore. To find out what happened, let's check logs. Now we can see that when we try to log in from our laptop to our gateway, this traffic is dropped. Double click on the log entry to see some more details on this. We see that it is a drop. It is dropped by a cleanup rule. And we see that that's the rule number 1. If we click here, we can even navigate right to this dropping rule. What we should do, we should a little bit update our policy. Let's add our first rule. We can add rule above. Here we can add any rule name we want. The best practice is to add a unique rule name for each rule. It will be much easier to search for this rule, and it will be much easier to keep your rules in order, because number of the rule may change if you will move the rule up or down, and it's not really representative of your current rule. So let's specify some meaningful rule name. I prefer to use the current date, and to add some little comment like admin SSH. So source will be our laptop. And for our laptop, we don't have any object yet. Checkpoint is object-based firewall. To allow anything to anything, you need to have an object. You need to have an object for host, network, service, and so on. Having no object means you cannot add this firewall rule for the laptop. We need first to create a host object. Let's enter the name. It will be admin laptop. And here we need to specify the IP address 168.43.1. And we can click OK. That's from admin laptop. And destination. Destination may be our firewalls, may be any. So I will make it any. Service applications, let's make it not any. Let's try something specific. We may need SSH. And also we may need HTTPS. And that's all we need so far. And we change the action to accept. It can be accept, drop. Also we have some more actions like reject, user authentication, client authentication. But for our access we just need accept. For tracking, we will lock our access and install this policy for whatever targets we select during policy installation. First we publish, and then we install policy. And we see that this installation was much faster. Also, if we go back to gateways and servers, we see now we have all the green check marks here, which is very good. Let's check if we can now connect back to our firewall. And now we can. We can go back to logs, and here we should refresh. We can set up refresh automatically, but it is just consuming resources, so we will refresh manually. Now we have this allow log. It means that our access was allowed by our firewall rule, and that's now the rule number 1, and action is accept here. Very good. What else we can see? We can check when the policy was installed with the command fw state. Oh, sorry, fw stat. It shows that it is standard policy, and that's the time when it was installed. Let's check what's up with our cluster. And now we have our cluster up and running. We have 2 gateways in the cluster. The first gateway has this sync interface IP.1, the second one is .2. 100% goes to the first gateway, it is active, the other one is standby. Here we have gateway name and also the latest cluster events are displayed here. Another very good command to check and troubleshoot cluster state is cphaprob -a if, means that we want to show all cluster interfaces in this cluster. And we have 3 interfaces, that is Ethernet 0, our management interface, it's Ethernet 1, which is our external interface, and also we have Ethernet 2, which is sync. We have a little bit of legend here, and we have cluster IP addresses, which is .5 and .1. It's very important that these IP addresses match with what we have in SmartConsole. Let's go back to SmartConsole and check. To check cluster topology, we view the cluster. We don't want to make any changes, so that's why we select just view, and then network management, and here's our topology. And we see that the virtual IP indeed match with our configuration between SmartConsole and the cluster. Let's now log in to our second firewall. Also, let's check when the policy was installed. And let's check the cluster state. Now we have the reverse information that the local is .2 and it is 100% standby firewall. Also, we see that the latest cluster change has this log code, and this is the change of init to standby. So all good. cphaprob -a if show us the cluster interfaces, and this information also matching between two cluster members, and it is matching with what we have in SmartConsole. This is the end of our third video. During this video, we completed the cluster configuration, pushed policy, and checked the cluster status through CLI. During next video, we will try some more troubleshooting commands, and also we will take a look what else we have in SmartConsole.